go, The Duchess of Malfi, Act 1, Scene 1. I'm just going to walk you through this scene. As you can see, I've got the script in front of me, and I've made some notes here in the margin. They're not very detailed, but they're just there as a guide. It's not my intention to exhaust this scene. There's much more you can say about it, but the aim of this video is just to show you what's going on roughly, and also to model to you how you can start to make sense of John Webster's text, his language and his style. So here we go. This is the Duchess of Malfi. As you can see at the beginning, no sign of the Duchess of Malfi, and it's just worth recognising that. The other thing I want you to recognise at the beginning is that Webster begins this in media res, as we call it. That's a Latin phrase. It literally means in the middle of the thing, and that's a very common theatre technique. But I just think it's one that we should recognise, and it just means that the world of the story appears to exist outside the action that we're seeing on the stage. And so rather than beginning the play with a sort of, once upon a time there was a king and setting out the background, Webster just shows us, we kind of butt in on the middle of the action with these characters. They're both coming on stage. They're not starting their conversation at this point. They appear to be in the middle of the conversation because Delio doesn't begin by saying, "Oh, hi, Antonio." They appear to have started the conversation already. So I think it's just worth noticing that Webster uses this kind of what we might call a realist technique at the beginning of his play. Okay, here we go. Antonio and Delio. Antonio is a steward. That means he's in charge of a household. He's like a senior servant. As it happens, he is the senior servant. He's the steward of the Duchess of Malfi's household. But we don't know that at this point, and Webster's audience wouldn't know it because they wouldn't have like a program with a list of who's who in front of them. They'd have to work all of this out themselves from the text. So in comes Antonio, and Delio is his friend. Delio says, "You are welcome to your country, dear Antonio." Oh, he's saying, "You are welcome back," is what he's saying. "You have been long in France," clear enough, "and you return a very formal Frenchman in your habit. How do you like the French court?" You return a very formal Frenchman in your habit. The key word there, and possibly a confusing one for some of you, is habit. Habit means your dress. So we still talk about a nun's habit. So he actually means dress. It might be worth thinking about whether there's an ambivalence there. He might mean habits as in the way we usually talk about habits these days as well. But I think the principal meaning is that he's saying in your appearance, your dress, you appear a very formal Frenchman. So I've written here, he's making an observation. He's drawing our attention to Antonio's appearance. Is Antonio a bit vain? He appears to, whilst he's been in France at the French court, he appears to have picked up some of their style, I guess. So Delio, he greets him. He gives us that bit of background information, and then how do you like the French court? That's a cunning sort of way of Webster giving Antonio now an excuse to talk about what he's now going to talk about. Antonio, I admire it. In seeking to reduce both state and people to a fixed order, their judicious king begins at home. So in seeking to reduce both state and people to a fixed order, that's not reduce in a negative way. That means to re-establish. He's sort of going back to basics, perhaps, to reduce both state and people to a fixed order. He's trying to consolidate, to keep a fixed order, which might be a good thing in a government. Clarity, a fixed order, clarity and structure. They're judicious. Judicious means well, good at judging, I guess. Their judicious, you can see that word judge in there. Their judicious king begins at home, right? In seeking to establish this, he begins at home. So he achieves his goal by, well, by starting with himself, by beginning at home, with his own palace and the people he keeps about him. We still kind of use that expression. We say that, good practice begins at home. So he quits first his royal palace. To leave. He leaves his royal palace, a flattering sycophants of dissoluble and infamous persons. So he appears to have left this palace of flattering sycophant. A sycophant is a suck-up. So of flattering suck-ups who appear to have sort of taken up lodging in his royal palace. So flattering sycophants of dissolute and infamous persons. Dissolute and infamous, disreputable, corrupt. So it appears that the king's palace formerly was full of people who were a bad influence. Infamous persons, which he sweetly terms his master's masterpiece, the work of heaven. That's potentially a bit confusing, because you wouldn't expect the king to sweetly term sycophants or infamous persons as a masterpiece or a work of heaven. That sounds like something good. So I think it's that it's the palace that was the masterpiece, and that he's left it, even though it's a great place, it's a masterpiece, it's a work of heaven. So in spite of these things, because it's full of these people, he's left it, which seems a very principled thing to do. So Antonio is full of admiration. He's very impressed with what he has learnt and observed in the French court. And he goes on here. You can see the semicolon there, which obviously the audience wouldn't be able to see, but they can hear it from what he says next. Considering duly that a prince's court is like a common fountain, that considering it's not the beginning of a new sentence. It's what we might call a subordinate clause. So grammatically, it's showing us that he's not finished, he's carrying on. So considering duly that a prince's court is like a common fountain. The prince's court is like a common fountain, like any fountain, like your typical fountain is what he means, a water fountain. Whence, from where? Whence should flow pure silver drops in general. In general means in just generally from a fountain, there should come, you would expect, there should flow pure silver drops. So a good fountain, a typical fountain, should spout pure water, pure silver drops. Just using imagery there to bring out the idea of purity. This is what a fountain should do. But if it chance that missing I there, the apostrophe, is just to make it fit the scansion, the rhythm of the line. We'll go into that another time. But if it chance some cursed example as in example of a person, so some individual, if by chance, if it happened that some cursed individual poison it meaning the fountain, if some cursed individual poisoned the fountain near the head, as in the head of the fountain, the root of the fountain. We often talk about the head of a spring, or the head of a river. So if somebody poisons the head of the river, then the whole river is poisoned. So if it chance that some accursed example poison it near the head, death and diseases through the whole land spread. So he's using this simile to emphasize that what he said earlier, to emphasize that it starts at home, it begins at home, honesty, good rulership, decency, justice, all of these things begin at home, and this is why he's abandoned his royal palace, and he has removed himself from dangerous influences of these sycophants and infamous persons who might influence the king. Probably just might worth re-establishing that, because I've been talking for a while. He's talking about the King of France who set this example. Antonio has been on his travels, and he's seen this court, this kingly court, which he's been very impressed with, and that's what he's reporting. He's reporting here. He's summarising what he's learnt. On he goes. Death and diseases through the whole land spread, if there is corruption close to the king. And what makes this blessed government but a most provident counsel? He's just being rhetorical here by asking that question. What is it that makes this blessed government that he's seen but a most provident counsel, who dare freely inform him the corruption of the times? This counsel is the men that the king keeps about him instead. Let's face it, they probably are men. So the men that the king keeps about him, a most provident counsel. Provident meaning, useful, helpful. This counsel is the. So what is it that makes this blessed government? The Provident Council is what makes this blessed government. And they're successful because they dare freely to inform him of the corruption of the times. They don't spend, in other words, they don't spend their time telling the king what he wants to hear, which is an easy thing to do, I would imagine, if you're a king's courtier and you're keen to please. Tell him what he wants to hear. He's saying that this government is blessed because of this most provident council, the people the king keeps around him, who dare freely to inform him of the corruption of the times, not of the good stuff. They tell him what the bad things that are going on in the kingdom. And now, having observed this, I've written theorising and drawing general rules about the government based on his experiences. This is what Antonio now tries to do. He's kind of he goes more general now. Though some of the court hold it presumption to instruct princes that they ought to do, so though some of the court, though some of the people around the king hold it in presumption, to presume, they are of the opinion, they presume, or they take it upon themselves to instruct princes what they ought to do. So to tell the prince in this case means ruler, rulers, to instruct princes what they ought to do, it is a noble duty to inform them what they ought to foresee. So, although some people hold it in presumption to instruct princes what they ought to do, instead, it's kind of missing an implied word there. What he means is, instead of telling princes what they ought to do, it is a noble duty to inform them what they ought to foresee. So to look into the future and warn them against consequences rather than telling them what they ought to do. Okay, so that's Antonio kind of wrapping up his learning from this trip he's been on to Paris. Let's just take a bit of stock here. He's been to France. I don't think France really features very much in the rest of the play. So why is this there? Well, it's introducing this theme to us, this theme of good rulership and of influence on a ruler and of corruption. And it's also enabling us just to see Antonio, who is just a steward and just maybe seems to have quite a high opinion of himself. Not terribly, but he seems very confident and outspoken. Maybe he's just, I don't know, punching a bit above his weight. But it's just a flicker of that at the moment. It's up to you, really. I mean, see what you think of that. Anyway, here there's a change. He says, "Here comes Beausoleil." Right, this is a an implicit stage direction, and it's really a cue highlighting to us, right, there's a new character coming on stage. We're still at this point in the play where we're in the opening seconds, people are being introduced. Here comes Bosela, the only court Gaul. That means the only Gaul is bitter, and so Bosela is the only bitter voice in the court at the moment. This isn't the French court. This is now we're back in Italy. Whose court are we in? It's not really made clear to us at this point. Bosela is in, I think we're in Ferdinand's court. Here comes Bosela, and he's the only sort of bitter voice in the court. Everyone else, of course, well, as we're later to find out, Ferdinand has surrounded himself with a bunch of yes men, in contrast to the French king that we're told about here. And Bosela is the only naysayer, the only person around the court who speaks bitterly. I don't think Antonio means that as praise in this case, but it's an interesting contrast. So Bosela is the only whinger in the court, really. Yet, he says, I observe his railing is not for simple love of piety. So he doesn't rail, he doesn't... to rail is to complain or to criticise. And so Antonio is saying, well, Bosela doesn't criticise or complain out of simple love of piety, because he's not complaining because he wants to put things right. He's not complaining out of virtue. Indeed, he rails at those things which he wants. He complains about things which he himself wants. So would be as lecherous, in other words, Bosela would be as lecherous, as covetous, or proud, bloody, or envious as any man if he had the means to be so. And he doesn't, because Bosela is quite low on the social spectrum. He doesn't have any money or means. So he's introducing Bosela here as, well, as the malcontent, and that's Bosela's stock character type. He is a malcontent. He's a disgruntled member he's a disgruntled individual from sort of lower in the social hierarchy who has an axe to grind. He's a malcontent. He's malcontent in French literally means unhappy. He is an unhappy individual. And I've just written here that Antonio seems to think that Bosela is a bit of a hypocrite, because he complains about things, but not on principle. He complains about them when Antonio thinks that he himself, if Bosela had money or means, he would be all these things: lecherous, he'd want to sleep with lots of people, he'd be greedy or covetous, he'd be proud, bloody, envious. And then here's the cardinal too. Here comes Bosela, here comes the cardinal. Seems to suggest that they enter from different sides of the stage. And so on they both come. Bosela, I do haunt you still, he says to the cardinal. He's sort of goading the cardinal here, saying, I'm still here, I'm following you, I'm haunting you. The cardinal just says, so. He ignores him, he dismisses him, he's not interested. So what? He appears to be saying. Bosela, I have done you better service than to be slighted thus. I've done you better service. I've served you better than this insult, this slight. A slight is an insult. Deserves. So I've done you better service to be slighted thus. Thus means in this way. And then he says, miserable age. He means the age they live in. Miserable age where only the reward of doing well is the doing of it. The word order is slightly confusing there. He means where the only reward of doing well is the doing of it. So the only reward for doing something good, doing a good thing, or in this case serving someone, helping someone, is the doing of it, is the actual action itself. In other words, there's no reward for doing good. The cardinal simply replies, you enforce your merits too much. you enforce, you argue your cause too much. Your merit is you're deserving. These days we like to think that people are appointed to positions or are given rewards on merit, on their deserving for having achieved something, for having exercised skill or ability. And the cardinal is saying you're making too much of your merit, to enforce, to argue for. Boesler replies, and of course he's giving us some background information here. Boesler's he's still kind of introducing to us his background. I fell into the galleys in your service. Right, the galleys, as in slave galleys, as in being chained to an oar so that you can row the galley across the Mediterranean. Horrible work and a horrible life. Where, he continues, in these galleys, for 2 years together I wore 2 towels instead of a shirt, with a knot on the shoulder after the fashion of a Roman mantle. So he's been slaving away in the galleys for 2 years. Okay, so that's news. I wonder why. Slighted thus, he says, again, to insult me like this. I will thrive some way, prosper. I will thrive some way. Blackbirds fatten best in hard weather. In other words, blackbirds fatten best. They fatten, they fatten up, they get their food, they do well. Blackbirds fatten best in hard weather. In hard weather, in difficult weather, he means. Why not I in these dog days? So if blackbirds can do well in difficult times, why can't I in these dog days? Dog days normally means hot weather in the summer without any rain. He might literally mean what the weather is like at the moment. We're in midsummer, or he might just mean that tough times in general. And the cardinal then says, he offers some advice, really. Would you become honest? Right? If only you would become honest, he suggests. The suggestion is that, then you might do okay, which is, as we'll find out later, is a terrible piece of hypocrisy by the cardinal, because he's terribly corrupt, and if you were acting this, you might well deliver that line as if it were obvious to Boesler that you were, well, for want of a better expression, taking the piss, mocking him. Oh, if only you would become honest. Boesler then says, well, with all your divinity, because he's the cardinal, remember, so divinity, connection with God, divineness, with all your divinity, do but direct me the way to it. So if you want me, if you suggest me to become honest, show me how to be honest. And Boesler, let's face it, he knows the cardinal is not honest. I have known many travel far for it, for honesty, I think he means. I've known many travel far for it, and yet return as arrant knaves. A knave is a misbehaving knight, I guess. Arrant, an arrant meaning wayward. So many people have travelled far for honesty, and yet come back as arrant knaves as they went forth, just as arrant as they were when they went forth, when they left, because they carried themselves always along with them. That's a slightly tricky line, that, but he really just means that I think that you can't change human nature. They carried themselves along. They remained themselves. So he's, as I've said, he's ridiculing really the cardinal's suggestion that he become honest, and I think he knows that the cardinal is being disingenuous. Disingenuous means the cardinal didn't really believe what he was saying when he said, oh, if only you would become honest. Moving on. Of course, whilst he's saying this, the cardinal has walked off the stage. So there's potentially a bit of humour here if Boesler is left uttering these lines, whilst in the meantime his audience, the cardinal, has in fact disappeared. So there's possibly a moment of humour there where he turns around and realises that the cardinal has gone. It's really important in this play to appreciate moments of humour, moments when it's funny. It's a tragedy, but it's a very funny play in places if it's executed well. So this is just an early example of an opportunity for humour, because of the dramatic irony that would build here, as Beausoleil continues to talk in the belief that the cardinal is listening to him, whereas in fact he's walked off. Beausoleil, understandably, is unhappy about this. He says, "Some fellows, they say, are possessed with the devil, but this great fellow were able to possess the greatest devil and make him worse." It's a bit convoluted, but I think the meaning there is simple enough. He's saying the cardinals he's worse than the devil. Moving on. Antonio and Delio, of course, have been sitting on the sidelines at this point. You might get the actors to talk to each other or mimic talking to each other. But clearly at this point Antonio has picked up on something that Beausoleil has been saying, and so he prompts Beausoleil for some more information. Hath he denied thee some suit? A suit is, well, something that you pursue. You can see that word there, you pursue, you follow. Has he denied you something that you're after, that you're following, that you're requiring of him? Beausoleil says, he and his brother, so he doesn't directly answer the question, he and his brother are like plum trees that grow. His brother, by the way, is Ferdinand. We haven't seen Ferdinand yet, but this is the first time Ferdinand is introduced. The cardinal, he and his brother are like plum trees. Well, that sounds good. Plum tree is nice, isn't it? Plum tree is something you get nice tasty fruit from. Plum trees that grow crooked. That grow crooked over standing pools. Oh dear. A standing pool is, well, a pool of standing water, as in not fresh water. It's not flowing, there's no fresh water coming into the pool. So he really means like plum trees that grow crooked over a stagnant pond. In other words, plum trees from which you would not eat the fruit. They are rich and o'erladen with fruit, but none but crows, pies, magpies, and caterpillars feed on them. You don't eat the fruit from a tree that's standing over a stagnant pool. There's quite a big extended metaphor there, which I could go into detail with, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to keep this moving. But that's something you could explore if you want. Beausoleil is good at coming up with this kind of extended simile. He uses them several times. So at this point in the scene, perhaps we're beginning to see Beausoleil as a talent, as a thinker. He's already showing himself as someone a bit more eloquent, a bit more quick-witted than Antonio, who maybe thinks he's witted, but maybe not as much as he thinks. On he goes. Could I be one of their flattering panders? So he means if I could be. Could I be? You want to get used to this kind of speech pattern. Could I be? He means if I could be one of their flattering panders. A pander, if you pander to somebody, you are, come back to that word from earlier, excuse me, if you pander to someone, you are telling them what they want to hear. You are a sycophant, you are a suck-up, you are a flatterer. So he's saying, if I could be one of these sycophants that they carry about them, I would hang on their ears like a horse leech. A horse leech is like a leech in a pond. So he's coming back to this simile that he brought in earlier, the standing pools. I would hang on their ears like a horse leech, like a big leech. Leeches don't tend to attach themselves to your ears. They can attach themselves to anywhere if you're unlucky. So a leech is a sort of they're invertebrates. Picture like a small slug that attaches itself to you and sucks the blood from you through your skin. So if I could be one of their pandas, I would I'd attach myself to them till I were full, and then drop off. So I'd suck their blood, and get money, get favours from them if I could suck up to them. Oh yes, and in fact the leech, the idea of sucking and the sucking up, that there's quite a nice little connection there. the only reason the leech is hanging on their ears is because by talking to the ear is the primary way of flattering someone, by talking to them. So that's why these leeches, this leech he's comparing himself to, would attach to them by their ears. And then he says, "I pray, leave me." He doesn't want to talk to Antonio about it. Who would rely upon these miserable dependencies in expectation to be advanced tomorrow? Let's just break that down. It's just slightly tricky. Who would rely? It's a rhetorical device. You can see that it's a question. It's a question. It's a rhetorical device. Who would rely upon these miserable dependencies? We know that he's chasing the cardinal for something. He deserves something. He's depending on something, having executed some service to the cardinal. So a dependency here, I think it means an assurance, some sort of expectation that he has from the cardinal. Basically, they had a deal. And he's saying, who would rely on that? What's the point in expecting anything from these people, these people that one depends on? Maybe he means someone to depend on by dependencies. But not in either case. He's talking about the cardinal and highlighting the futility, the uselessness of expecting. There's in expectation to be advanced, paid tomorrow. What's the point in expecting to be rewarded or paid by these people? He's had enough. What creature ever fed worse than hoping Tantalus? So Tantalus, that's a classical reference. So we still have that word. So tantalizing is to keep someone waiting. It's a classical reference. So again, Boesler, educated, intelligent, knows his stuff. Nor ever died any man more fearfully than that he hoped for a pardon. No man ever died more fearfully, more terribly than the man who hoped for a pardon. So he's just saying, "Oh, give up. There's no point in hoping for these people, in holding out for any sort of reward." And then he goes on, "There are rewards for hawks and dogs when they have done us service." So hunting animals, when they come back to you, they get rewarded as a sort of way of training them. But for a soldier that hazards his limbs in a battle, nothing but a kind of geometry is his last supportation. Now this is a puzzle which he's about, and you can see that Delio actually asks him to unpack this strange reference. But you can hopefully see his rhetorical device. So even the dogs and the hawks get rewarded, but for a soldier who risks his life and hazards his limbs in a battle, he can expect nothing by way of support, reward. Delio asks him, "Geometry? What on earth do you mean, man?" Geometry is, hopefully you know, is a mathematical term. And Boesler now explains this. He says, "Aye, to hang in a fair pair of slings, take his latter swing in the world upon an honourable pair of crutches from hospital to hospital." It's still slightly tricky, this, and just needs a bit of unpacking. To hang in a fair pair of slings, a sling as in the kind of thing that you hang an injured limb. Take his latter swing in the world upon an honourable pair of crutches. So you swing between crutches if you have crutches, if you're injured, if you've broken your leg, or indeed if you have no legs because you've been in a battle. Take his latter swing in the world. Your swing in the world, your turn, your life, really. So spend the rest of your latter swing, the rest of your days in the world, upon a pair of crutches. He adds honourable there as a sort of ironic joke. So the geometry of swinging on a pair of crutches is your reward for service in battle, is is what he's saying. So it's one of his characteristic kind of clever, dark jokes. Fare ye well, sir, he's off. And yet do not you scorn us, for places in the court are but like beds in the hospital, where this man's head lies at that man's foot, and so lower and lower. He means cramped conditions here, literally. He's off and basically saying, do not you scorn us, don't joke or hold me in contempt once I'm gone. And why is that? Well, because for places in the court are but like beds in hospital. He's saying it's cramped in court. So he's saying it's a warning. Don't laugh once I'm gone, because you might end up in the same sort of position as me. It's cramped in court, it's busy, you never know what might happen to you. I think that's what he's saying. Delio, he's gone. Delio picks up his conversation with Antonio. I knew this fellow 7 years in the galleys for a notorious murderer. So he's filling us in, giving us some information on Bosola. I knew this fellow 7 years in the galleys for a notorious murderer. I think that's Delio when he was in the galleys, or doesn't seem very likely for Delio. We won't trouble ourselves with that too much. He's giving us a slightly different version of Bosola's story. I knew him 7 years in the galleys for a notorious murder. So he was in the Bosola was in the galleys as a murderer, and which was notorious, well known. And 'twas thought the cardinal suborned it. Oh, right. Effectively, Bosola, by this story, was an assassin who was commissioned by the cardinal. So you can imagine, if that's true, why Bosola might be rather unhappy. He was carrying out the cardinal's business, and it would appear that when caught, the cardinal let him rot, basically, and disowned the enterprise, made no attempt to extract Bosola from his punishment. So he's got a real axe to grind, it would appear. He was released by the French general, Gaston de Foix, when he recovered Naples. Recovered as in to take back. So Naples changed hands back to the French, at which point it would appear that Bosola was freed. We're nearly at the end of the scene now. Antonio, 'tis great pity he should be thus neglected. Oh, okay. Bit of pity, interest there for Bosola from Antonio. 'Tis great pity he should be thus neglected. I've heard he's very valiant. This foul melancholy, so his bad temper, his bitterness from Bosola, will poison all his goodness. Because, I'll tell you, if too immoderate sleep be truly said to be an inward rust unto the soul, immoderate, so moderate means not too much, immoderate therefore means too much. So if too much sleep, if it's be truly said, so if it's true, if it's a true saying that too much sleep is an inward rust unto the soul, rust is a sort of decay, or even corruption. So if sleep is a bad or corrupt influence on the soul, that should say it, not if. That's this is Project Gutenberg's text. That's almost certainly a mistake. So if too much sleep is a corruption or rust unto the soul, it then doth follow, therefore, by the same token, it follows that want of action, so lack of action, breeds all black malcontents. That's not a racial word. It just means sort of black at heart, devilish. So want of action, want of stuff to do, inactivity breeds all black malcontents. So it's a shame that Bosola isn't kind of well occupied, because this melancholy seems to be, he's brooding on it. So yeah, Antonio, he's generalising again, not for the first time. He I've written there, is he being a little superior? He does just seem to be a little confident with his own opinions. Nonetheless, showing a bit of compassion there towards Bosola, and that's just a useful thing to register at this point. So, and then he says, and their close rearing, like moths in a cloth, do hurt for want of wearing. If you've ever lost clothing to moths because you've folded them up and put them away somewhere, and then you take them out after 6 months or 12 months or 18 months and you found that they've been eaten by moths, then you'll know the kind of the comparison he's making here. He's basically saying Bosola needs, like, he needs exercise, he needs to be used, but he's being close reared, so he's not really being used to the full of his abilities. It's like he's been tucked away in a drawer without any mothballs, and so he's and not being worn. So he's going to be corrupted again. So Antonio, like Bosola, can use similes. I don't know, they're just, for some reason, they're just not quite as swashbuckling and fun as Bosola's similes, and that's in keeping with his character, as we'll see. So that's scene one. Plot-wise, nothing happens really. We know Antonio's come back. Let's just do a quick recap. We know Antonio's come back. He's friends with Delio. We know that the Cardinal seems to owe Bosola something, and he's not happy about it. And we know, or we're certainly told by Bosola that the Cardinal and Ferdinand, who we haven't met yet, who are brothers, are corrupt as sin, basically, but in positions of high power. And of course, Webster has introduced those themes of corruption, and justice to us, and those are going to be important as the play progresses. But really, in terms of plot, not very much has happened yet, and we haven't even met Ferdinand, and we haven't met the Duchess of Malfi. So, and it's just worth pointing that out. There's a reason for that. Webster could easily have introduced the Duchess of Malfi straight away, but he's opted not to. So that's it. That's scene one.